Canada. You guys have a weird demography, and it's shaped like this because you went through the same process that the United States went through with the aging and the shrinking of the birth rate. But you're also a high inward immigration country, but you don't get kids. You get people in their 20s and their 30s. That bulge down there in the 20s and the 30s, about a third of that is immigrants, which means that you have a danger and an opportunity. The danger is obvious. You guys are on an immigration treadmill. You have been for 40 years. And as long as the people come in at the pace that they retire, your workforce maintains its coherence, your capital base is fine. But if it stops for any reason, all of a sudden you have a huge surge of retirees that you have to pay for and whose capital is leaving the system and nothing replacing from below. That's the situation that BC is in right now, because BC has gotten into the trap where they got addicted to the financial income that came from people coming in and buying property, but then the immigrants didn't stay. They just dropped their cash, they bought a condo and moved on. And so the BCers are dealing with all the distortions of high migration without any of the benefits. The opportunity is that all that foreign money needs a better place to go. Real estate is all well and good, but it's very distortionary, and that's one of the reasons that the Trudeau government is changing the laws on real estate starting in January so that foreigners just can't buy. Well, the foreigners are still going to be looking for a place to put their money into a country that's relatively open and has good rule of law. That would be you again. You just need to give them a place to sink that money into. Now, foreign money is not particularly picky. They're after three things: a hard asset, a dividend, rule of law. Now, real estate matches two of those categories. A government bond matches two. But what if you guys were to do provincial development bonds to fund infrastructure build out? That would scratch all four itches. And the amount of money that is up for grabs here is immense. The capital flight into the United States in calendar year 2021 was over $2 trillion. You guys probably got 300 billion. So on a percentage base, people prefer to put their money in Canada over the United States, but it needs to go into a place that is actually useful for you. So you need to provide a financial asset that is attractive. And if you pair that with a minerals build out, you can get somebody else's money to pay for a lot of it all. Like it? All right, final slide. Here's inflation, Canada and the United States, similar economies. You'd expect the data to track. It does. Inflation in both of our countries has followed an interesting pattern that you can break into three chunks. First, we had that initial industrial build out with globalization in the 50s and 60s, where we were building the suburbs and building rail systems and running power lines into the countryside. Industrial, demand-driven inflation. All of our baby boomers came of age. They had their kids, they moved into the suburbs, they built their homes, they bought cars. Consumer demand-driven inflation. And then we had this weird era. The Chinese dumped 1 billion workers onto global manufacturers markets, and the price of manufactured goods dropped 30 years. The Soviet system collapsed, and we had 30 years of low commodity prices because all of the stuff they used to build, they just dumped on the global market. All of these trends are now back in play, but they look a lot different. The Chinese labor is now notable for the fact that it's dying out. The Russian materials are going away. The baby boomers may be retiring, but their kids, the millennials, are now at the peak of their consuming years, and they will be for another decade. Industrialization is happening again because we have to basically double the size of the industrial plant in North America to compensate for the loss of China and Germany. Every inflationary trend we've had for the last 75 years is back. And every disinflationary trend has flipped all at the same time. We are looking at 9 to 15% inflation in North America for at least the next 5 years, assuming we succeed at doubling the size of the industrial plant. If we fail to do that, not only will the inflation continue for more than 5 years, we will also have product shortages of every kind imaginable. So we have a choice. We can do the build out and experience not just high inflation, but the greatest economic growth in the history of both of our countries. And we can end up with a supply chain system that is greener, cleaner, shorter, that employs North Americans, that is simpler and more secure and immune to international risk. Or we can not do that and go without stuff. I know I have a preference, but I'm not the decision maker here. You are. The reason why the policy is the way it is because until very recently, the competition for these sorts of material production has been very limited. The Russians have been dumping things on the market for 30 years because they paid for all of the upfront investment during the Soviet period, and competing with that price model has been very difficult So anyone who has a higher cost for production, for example, for environmental reasons, has gradually been squeezed out of the market. And it's only with the rise of electric vehicles and electrification writ large that all of a sudden the market has changed enough to demand new sources of supply. And that's happening at the same time that we're losing the Russian supply. So the market really has shifted. So don't think of past failures and divestments in the system as determining your future, because the environment really has changed now. In terms of local community buy-in, that's not limited to Canada. It's not limited to the First Nations. This is a common problem with mining wherever it happens to be. And the trick is to give the locals a say and a benefit and preferably participation in the sector without allowing it to be a veto. So, for example, what they're doing in British Columbia with a number of the pipelines coming in from Alberta, I would argue that that is the absolute worst way to do it because it's just turned into a block. Activists have come in from elsewhere in Canada and from outside of Canada and have basically worked with Indigenous communities to shoot that project, every project, in the head repeatedly. And it was only with the direct intervention of Trudeau that even one of them might happen. I would say it's not a foregone conclusion. The way to approach it is for Manitoba's provincial government and the First Nations to come up with a plan together, one that actually benefits the provincial government and the local communities, in which the local communities are not simply bystanders. I am from Iowa, and I grew up next to the only settlement that we have for natives in the United States. We have a lot of reservations where the natives aren't in charge of anything, and those are a disaster. But the Meskwaki settlement in Iowa actually farms, actually has manufacturing, actually has a services economy because they have a vested interest in their own land. And Canada has more of a political environment that allows things like that to happen. But unfortunately, as a rule, the First Nations are physically sequestered from what you would call the other Canadian population. And that is something you need to bridge, because almost all of this stuff that is worth working on is in the north, and that is why we are here. But that means you not only have to figure out a path for the capital and a path for the regulation, but a diplomatic path both internally and externally. One, so that the local and the provincial government can be on the same page, can write the page together. And then second, and this is very important, so that the Indigenous communities are represented whenever the provincial government goes out and tries to make a pitch to whoever the potential investor might be. They don't just have to be in the room, they have to be at the table. That is how you make this work. And there's some good examples in places like, say, New Zealand that have found a way to make this work very well, but it does require a lot of forethought. If you don't put in that forethought, you're going to be in this same position where it's going to take months or even years for companies to get basic answers, and then they'll be going into a community that hasn't really been consulted or brought into the process. So you need to do that absolutely in depth on the front end, and the First Nations have to be represented in many ways, have to lead it if it's going to work.